Ancient Egypt, a civilization of splendor, awe, and astonishing mysteries. Land of the pharaohs, pyramids, and eternal gods. But behind the dazzling facade of monuments and golden sarcophagi lies a deep, unresolved question that echoes through centuries. Were the ancient Egyptians black? This question transcends race. It's about heritage, identity, colonialism, and cultural truth. For generations, scholars, historians, and activists have argued from different ideological camps. Were the Egyptians Mediterranean Caucasians? Were they indigenous Africans? Or were they a fusion of both, molded by millennia of migration, conquest, and cultural exchange? Peeling back the layers of time, we find stories not just in DNA and mummies, but in art, language, and forgotten ruins. There is no single answer, yet the weight of truth grows stronger with every unearthed tomb and deciphered glyph. Ancient Egypt did not rise in isolation. It was a civilization born from the pulse of the Nile, nurtured by the rhythms of Africa, and enriched by its location at the crossroads of continents. This mystery is more than academic. It impacts how we understand African civilization, how Black communities around the world perceive their ancestral legacy, and how historical narratives have been shaped, sometimes twisted by politics and power. The story of Egypt is a mirror. What we see reflected in it reveals as much about the present as it does about the past. Today on Tales Beyond Time, we will venture through archaeology, history, anthropology, and myth to confront the silence and ask, who were the true faces of Kemet? Brace yourself. This story may change what you thought you knew. To understand ancient Egypt's roots, we must travel south to the lands of Nubia, Sudan, and the African interior. Egypt is the gift of the Nile, as Herodotus wrote, and the Nile flows from deep within the African continent. Along this river, communities settled thousands of years before the pyramids were built. Before dynastic Egypt, there was Tas-Sadi in Nubia, considered by many scholars the world's first kingdom. It predates the first dynasty and showed complex social organization, advanced pottery, and royal tombs. The earliest kings of Egypt may have emerged from or intermarried with Nubian elites. Archaeological finds in Nakata, Hierakonpolis, and Abydos show a remarkable similarity to Nubian culture in tools, burial practices, and religious symbolism. Pre-dynastic Egyptians often buried their dead in fetal positions, surrounded by items for the afterlife, a tradition still found in ancient African burials across the continent. Anthropologists studying the skeletal remains from these early cemeteries noticed something striking. The physical characteristics of these populations included elongated skulls, prognathism, and craniofacial features aligned more with indigenous African populations than Mediterranean or Near Eastern ones. Moreover, ancient Egyptian art depicts people with reddish-brown skin, a tone distinct from the pale Asiatics and the darker Nubians they also portrayed. This diversity points not to a single race, but to a core African identity that engaged with surrounding cultures. So from its genesis, Egypt was an African civilization born of African soil, peopled by African blood, and breathing African air. Its founders were not strangers to the continent, but children of it. The Egyptians were master artists, and their self-perception is preserved in stone. Tomb paintings, reliefs, and statues reveal how they saw themselves and how they saw others. In these vivid artworks, Egyptians consistently portrayed themselves with reddish-brown skin, curly or straight black hair, and broad features. In contrast, Libyans were painted with pale skin and blue eyes, Asiatics with yellowish skin, and Nubians with darker complexions. This wasn't racial classification in the modern sense, but cultural differentiation. Egyptians viewed themselves as distinct, yet they never claimed whiteness. Sphinx, pharaohs, and commoners were carved with full lips and broad noses, traits commonly associated with black Africans. The bust of Pharaoh Tutankhamun, the statues of Mentuhotep II, and the wall carvings of Seti I all show African features preserved in glorious detail. One of the most famous pharaohs, Nurmer, who united Upper and Lower Egypt, came from the south. His dynasty originated closer to Nubia than to the Mediterranean coast. The southern Upper Egyptians, where the civilization began, were darker-skinned and more closely related to Nubians. Even their gods reflected African characteristics. Anubis, with his jet-black color, symbolized rebirth and protection. The color black itself in Egyptian symbolism meant fertility and life, closely tied to the rich silt of the Nile. The visual record clearly places the Egyptians within a broader African tradition. Their representations weren't just artistic choices, they were declarations of identity. And they were proud of it. Over millennia, Egypt absorbed influences from Asia and Europe, but its heart remained rooted in the African Nile. As Egypt's monuments rose again in Western imagination during the 19th century, something sinister happened. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt coincided with European imperialism, and what followed was a cultural hijacking of history. European scholars, influenced by racism and colonial superiority, could not fathom a black African civilization as advanced as Egypt. To reconcile their worldview, they began to depict Egyptians as Mediterranean or even European in origin. Museums in London, Paris, and Berlin showcased Egyptian artifacts while quietly altering facial features in reconstructions. Broad noses became straight, lips thinned, skin lightened. Egypt was branded as the exception in Africa civilized, despite its location. The damage was profound. For over a century, textbooks taught children that Africa had no history, while Egypt was treated as a part of the Near East. The term Middle East itself was crafted during colonial times, pulling Egypt away from its African context. But resistance grew. African scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop challenged the status quo. Using carbon dating, linguistics, and anthropology, Diop argued that Egypt was a black civilization. He even proved that melanin levels in ancient mummies aligned with African populations. Western academia dismissed him for decades. But his work inspired generations and reawakened a global movement to restore African contributions to world history. Meanwhile, modern Egypt added another layer of complexity. Contemporary Egyptians often see themselves as separate from Black Africa. Yet genetics shows significant sub-Saharan ancestry in ancient mummies, especially from Upper Egypt. The erasure of Egypt's black past wasn't accidental. It was engineered by colonial minds unwilling to admit that Africa birthed one of the world's greatest civilizations. Today, that erasure is slowly being undone. With advancements in science, new tools now illuminate ancient mysteries. DNA analysis, bioarchaeology, and climate adaptation studies are reshaping our view of Egypt's past. In 2017, a DNA study on mummies from abuser El Millis caused global headlines. It concluded these mummies shared more genetic affinity with Near Easterners than modern sub-Saharan Africans. Critics pounced, claiming this disproved Egypt's African identity. But there's a problem. The mummies tested came from the late period, long after Egypt had endured invasions by Persians, Greeks, and Romans. The study ignored mummies from Upper Egypt, where the civilization began, and where DNA preservation is far more difficult. Earlier skeletal analyses from pre-dynastic sites, like Nakata and Kustal, show that these early Egyptians had physical traits consistent with East African populations: elongated limbs, broad noses, and high melanin levels, a natural adaptation to tropical climates. Climatology also plays a role. Ancient Egypt's environment necessitated certain adaptations found in African populations, not Mediterranean ones. Evolution doesn't lie. Moreover, ancient inscriptions, like the tomb of Harkhof, describe journeys into the interior of Africa, not as exotic adventures, but as familial returns. Egypt traded, mingled, and intermarried with its southern neighbors. Scientific consensus is shifting. Egypt's population was diverse over time. Yes, but at its origin, it was primarily composed of indigenous Africans, shaped by the Nile Valley ecosystem. The genetic record, when fully examined, supports what the art and anthropology have long suggested. Egypt was deeply, inextricably African. If DNA offers one view, culture offers another, and Egyptian culture is unmistakably African. Many religious practices in Egypt mirror African spiritual systems. Ancestor veneration, spirit communication, sacred animals, and cosmic balance. Concepts like Mat reflect African moral philosophies still practiced across the continent. Totemism, ritual purification, and initiation ceremonies, all hallmarks of Egyptian religious life, exist in traditional African societies today. Language, too, tells a story. Ancient Egyptian is a branch of the Afro-Asiatic language family, closely linked to Berber, Cushitic, and Chadic tongues. Some scholars, including Diop, noted similarities between Egyptian and West African languages, like Wolof. And then there's Nubia. The Nubians and Egyptians had a dynamic relationship of rivalry and respect. At times, Nubians ruled Egypt, the 25th dynasty, known as the Kushite pharaohs, reigned as traditionalists and restorers of ancient values. Rather than erase Egypt's identity, Nubian rule highlighted their shared roots. Temples at Gebel Barkal, inscriptions in Meroitic, and the pyramids of Napata show continuity of belief, art, and authority across the Nile Valley. Egypt was not a lone marvel. It was part of a thriving African world. To deny its Africanness is to sever it from the very soil that gave it life. Let us now turn to the most tangible remnants of ancient Egypt, the mummies and royal portraits. They are the literal faces of the past, preserved in linen and resin. These remains allow us to peer directly into the biology of the pharaohs and the people they ruled. The preserved mummies of pharaohs, like Ramesses II and Seti, I have sparked debates for decades. Ramesses II's mummy, in particular, features tightly curled hair and features that some scientists describe as consistent with African populations. Early French scientists in the 1970s concluded that he had negroid, features a term now outdated, but then used to describe sub-Saharan African traits. Pharaoh Tutankhamun has been the subject of numerous reconstructions. Some forensic reconstructions, curiously, depicted him with pale skin, despite his family's origins in southern Egypt, and his depiction in tomb art as a brown-skinned youth. Critics argue that these reconstructions reflect modern biases rather than ancient reality. But beyond physical traits, the symbolism in their burials also tells a story. The gods and goddesses surrounding the pharaohs and tombs were adorned in colors and styles deeply rooted in African traditions. Hairstyles, amulets, and burial positions mirror those found in Nubian and deeper African burial sites. Art and mummification were not just religious, they were statements of belonging. The way Egyptians painted themselves bold, dignified, and brown reflected their identity and ideals. Any modern effort to sanitize or whiten their image does not stem from the ancient world, but from modern insecurities and agendas. Through these silent, embalmed witnesses, Egypt continues to speak if we are willing to see. The fascination with ancient Egypt has spanned centuries and continents, influencing architecture, fashion, film, and philosophy. From Napoleon's conquest of Egypt to Hollywood's portrayals of Cleopatra, this once African civilization has been reimagined again and again, often through Eurocentric lenses. In modern pop culture, Egypt is frequently presented as a mystical land of white-robed priests and fair-skinned royals. Films like The Ten Commandments and Exodus, gods and kings cast white actors as pharaohs, continuing the erasure of Egypt's African identity. Even museum exhibits sometimes shy away from representing the diversity of ancient Egyptian people. But cultural appropriation is not just about casting, it's about narrative ownership. When African Americans and people of African descent embrace Egypt as part of their heritage, critics often accuse them of revisionism. Yet when European scholars detach Egypt from Africa, it's labeled scholarly objectivity. The legacy of ancient Egypt must be returned to the communities it has inspired for generations. The symbolism of pyramids, the image of the Sphinx, and the divine strength of African queens like Nefertari and Hatshepsut are more than museum relics. They are living emblems of cultural pride and spiritual resilience. African diasporic movements, such as Pan-Africanism and Afrocentrism, have long drawn strength from Egypt. Civil rights leaders like Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey referenced Egypt as proof that black people had a glorious past. Today, artists, educators, and activists continue to use Egypt's legacy to challenge systemic racism and reclaim historical dignity. It's not just a matter of who built Egypt, but of who is allowed to remember and honor it. You might wonder, why does it still matter who the Egyptians were? Why revisit ancient debates in a modern world battling new challenges? Because history is power, and the stories we tell shape the identities we live by. If Egypt, the crown jewel of antiquity, is stripped from Africa and disconnected from black identity, then a piece of humanity's shared legacy is distorted. In classrooms, museums, and media, representations of greatness influence how people see themselves. If black children grow up learning that all civilization came from Europe or the Middle East, they are denied a powerful connection to their own heritage. Correcting the narrative isn't about excluding others. It's about including those who are intentionally left out. It's about restoring the voices silenced by conquest and colonialism. The truth about ancient Egypt isn't hidden. It's buried under assumptions, miseducation, and centuries of ideological agendas. Uncovering it requires courage, scholarship, and a willingness to let go of comforting myths. This isn't just Egypt's story. It's the story of how the world remembers Africa. And that makes all the difference. So, were the ancient Egyptians black? The evidence historical, biological, cultural, and spiritual points to a resounding truth. Egypt was born of Africa, shaped by African hands, and infused with African spirit. And yet, the debate rages on. Because this is not just a question of history. It is a battle for memory, for dignity, for truth. We must continue to tell the full story without erasure, without distortion, and without fear. From the temples of Karnak to the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, from the scrolls of African scholars to the voices of modern diasporas, the truth is waiting to be heard. Let us remember Egypt, not just as a marvel of antiquity, but as a beating heart of African genius. If this journey challenged what you thought you knew, then join us in sharing the story. Like, comment, and subscribe to Tales Beyond Time for more untold histories that defy convention. Drop your thoughts below. What do you believe about the identity of the ancient Egyptians? And what other mysteries should we explore? History isn't just what happened, it's how we choose to remember it. Let's remember boldly.